The Battle of Gonzales was the first battle in the Texan Revolution, the revolution that saw Texas become an independent republic and eventually a state in the United States of America. The battle was fought between Texan militiamen and the Mexican government after they attempted to confiscate a cannon owned by the Texans to prevent Indian raiding. In 1824, the Mexican Empire was overthrown and a constitution was written. This constitution made Mexico a republic and importantly gave the new republic very lax immigration laws, allowing foreigners to settle in border regions such as Texas. In 1825, 400 American families established a colony in Texas between the San Marcos and Guadalupe rivers. This colony, referred to as the DeWitt Colony after its founder, suffered greatly from raids led by the Karankawa, Tonkawa, and Comanche tribes. The capital of the DeWitt Colony, Gonzales, was destroyed in a raid in July of 1826. DeWitt managed to establish peace treaties with two of the Indian tribes, but the Comanche refused. The Comanche continued to raid the colony for the next few years. In 1831, the colonists went to the county leader and asked for military support. The Mexican government couldn't afford to station soldiers in the colony, so instead the colonists were given a small 6-pounder cannon. The cannon was described by historian Timothy Todish as being a small cannon good for little more than starting horse races. During the 1830s, the Mexican government was incredibly unstable, fluctuating between federalist and centralist policies. In 1835, the government was incredibly centralist, leading to some states revolting. In Texas, new taxes and tariffs had been established, with Juan Davis Bradburn, an American-born Mexican military officer, being appointed the commander of customs on Galveston Bay. He established a post at the entrance of the Trinity River, which would later be known as Anahuac. It was from this post that he oversaw customs in Galveston Bay. Bradburn became very unpopular with the local Anglo-Americans as he strongly opposed the American immigrants in the area and fought with the state commissioner on the sales of land to Americans near Galveston Bay. In 1832, Bradburn became increasingly paranoid of Anglo-Americans wanting Texas to secede from Mexico. In June of 1832, two of Bradburn's soldiers attacked an American woman. Some settlers tarred and feathered the neighbors of the woman for not helping her and demanded that Bradburn let them do the same to the soldiers. After Bradburn refused this, the Texans formed a militia, officially to protect against Indian raids. Mexican law forbade the establishment of militias, so Patrick Jack, the leader of the militia, was arrested. Mexican law outlawed slavery, and Bradburn was a firm supporter of this, so when 3 escaped slaves from Louisiana came to him for protection, he took them in. In response to this, the slave owner sent a lawyer named William Travis to reclaim the slaves. Bradburn was then sent a letter from his friend, informing him that 100 armed men were coming to take back the slaves. When Bradburn realized that the letter was fraudulent, he arrested Travis, believing he had written the letter to try and cause a revolution in Texas. This enraged the Texans, unaware that Mexican law allowed for arrest without a warrant. Jack threatened Bradburn, so he was arrested again. Travis and Jack thus began plotting their escape. They sent letters to David Burnett, the man who would later become the interim Texan president. These letters called on the Texans to help them, though didn't call for armed revolution specifically. Bradburn intercepted these letters, and they were never delivered to Burnett. The Anglo-American settlers were alarmed to learn that Bradburn was taking witness statements without informing Jack, Travis, or their lawyers. Jack's brother thus organized a group of men to march from Brazoria to Anahuac. A Brazorian councilman, John Austin, spoke to the commander of the garrison along the Brazos River, who recommended Austin request for Travis and Jack be taken into civilian custody until their trial. Bradburn told the men that it was illegal for the accused men to be handed over to civilians, so they left. The Mexicans soon realized all their horses were gone, and so they arrested 2 men under suspicion of theft. Upon hearing this, the Brazorian men decided to return to Anahuac, setting up a camp near a group of other men who were also mad at the Mexicans. The men formed a militia with Frank Johnson as their commander. They then captured 19 cavalry officers, who were found reconnoitering them. On June 10th, the men captured and occupied buildings in northern Anahuac. Bradburn feared they were planning a full-scale revolt, so he threatened the men. Bradburn had Travis and Jack tied to the ground and pointed weapons at them, threatening to shoot them. Travis encouraged Johnson to attack the Mexicans anyway. The Texan militiamen offered to exchange the 19 cavalry officers for the Texan prisoners the Mexicans had. The Mexicans agreed to this, so long as the Texans withdrew to Turtle Bayou. Most of the Texans left Anahuac, though some remained in the city. Bradburn thus told the Texans he would be firing on the city in 2 hours. The Texans believed they had been betrayed by Bradburn, who just wanted to get them out of the buildings before attacking them. The women and children fled the city while the men stayed to fight. A small skirmish began in which 5 Mexican troops died, with only 1 Texan death. The remaining Texans retreated to Turtle Bayou, where they waited for reinforcements from Brazoria, including artillery. The Texans signed the Turtle Bayou Resolution, in which they decried the current Mexican government and its violations of their rights, declaring their support for Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna, a Mexican general currently fighting a revolution. While the Texans were waiting for their reinforcements, the Mexicans were doing the same. John Austin had returned to Brazoria to gather the reinforcements. While there, he attempted to have the men in charge of the garrison at the Brazos River join their cause. He refused, so Austin attacked their fort. The men surrendered to Austin, agreeing to hand over their artillery if they were allowed to leave. This artillery would end up being useless, as the Texans in Anahuac signed an agreement with Bradburn, in which he resigned and handed his prisoners into civilian custody. On September 10th, a Mexican soldier beat a Gonzales resident, leading to widespread outrage and protests. The Mexican government viewed it as irresponsible to leave the citizens with a weapon, so Colonel Domingo de Ugartequia, commander of all troops in Mexico, ordered 5 men to confiscate the cannon given to Gonzales. A meeting was held in Gonzales, in which 3 citizens voted to hand over the cannon to forestall an attack, while everyone else agreed to stand and fight. When the soldiers arrived in Gonzales, they were forced out of the town without the cannon. The town anticipated that the Mexicans would send more troops to take the cannon by force, so they sent a messenger to the nearest town, Mina, requesting assistance. Word quickly came that 300 Mexicans were going to march on Gonzales. Stephen Austin, the de facto leader of the Texans, sent messengers to all nearby communities, informing them of the situation. He cautioned the Texans to remain on the defensive, as he feared they wouldn't get support from the US if they were to attack first. On September 27th, 1835, 100 dragoons, led by Francisco de Castanado, left San Antonio de Bexar, bringing an official order for Gonzales to surrender the cannon. Castanado had been ordered to avoid conflict if possible. Castanado neared Gonzales on the 29th of September, but he was on the wrong side of the Guadalupe River, and the Texans had destroyed all the boats used to cross it. On the opposite side of the river were 18 Texans, referred to as the Old 18, who informed Castanado that the governor of Gonzales had left the town and that they would need to remain on the west bank of the river until he returned. Castanado saw no easy way to cross the river, so he established a camp on a hill 270 meters from it. 3 Texans quickly buried the cannon, while others traveled to nearby towns to request rapid reinforcements. By the end of the day, Gonzales had received 80 reinforcements. They then elected John Henry Moore as their leader, with Joseph Washington Elliott Wallace and Edward Burleson as second and third in command. The next day, Castanado demanded the cannon be surrendered again, with the Texans once again refusing. In San Antonio de Bexar, Ugartequia asked a Gonzales town resident, who was in San Antonio for personal business, to help him peacefully confiscate the cannon. He arrived at the army camp on the 1st of October, and he told the Texans that the Mexican soldiers would leave if they gave up the cannon. Caldwell, one of the Texan militiamen, told him to bring Castanado into Gonzales to discuss the matter the next morning. At the same time, Moore called a war council, which quickly voted to fight the Mexicans. It is unclear whether Moore knew Caldwell had promised Castanado peaceful entrance to the town. The cannon was dug up, and James C. Neal, an American artilleryman, was put in command of it. The city had no cannonballs, so they instead used any metal scraps they could find. Neal gathered several men, including Almiron Dickinson, another former US artilleryman, creating the first Texan artillery company. A local Methodist minister blessed the militiamen in a sermon in which he drew many parallels to the American Revolution. While the Texans were making plans for battle, Castanado learned from an Indian that there were 140 men in Gonzales, with reinforcements being expected soon. The Mexicans began searching for a place to safely cross the river, moving their camp 11 kilometers upstream. At 7 p.m. that night, the Texans crossed the river, with less than half the men being mounted. At around midnight, a thick fog rolled in, slowing their travel. The Texans reached the New Mexican camp at around 3 a.m. A dog barked as they neared, and the Mexican troops quickly fired in the direction of the Texans. The Texans were all unharmed except for one man whose horse bucked him, giving him a bloody nose. The Texans hid behind the trees and waited for dawn. Some Texans raided a nearby field, taking watermelons which they then ate. The Mexicans withdrew 270 meters to a nearby bluff. At around 6 a.m. the fog had parted enough that the fighting could properly begin. The Texans emerged from behind the trees, firing at will on the Mexican soldiers. The Mexicans sent 40 cavalry units after the Texans, who fled to the trees where they then fired another volley, injuring a Mexican soldier. The Mexican cavalry couldn't attack the Texans, so they retreated to the bluff. Castaneda sent the Gonzales resident who was working with them to the Texan army, hoping to meet with their leader. The man was promptly arrested by the Texans, though Moore agreed to meet with Castaneda. Moore told Castaneda that he and his men no longer followed Santa Anna, instead remaining faithful to the Mexican Constitution of 1824. Castaneda agreed with Moore, but he was honor-bound to follow the orders he was given. As Moore returned to the Texans, they raised a white flag with a black cannon painted on the center. Under the cannon was the slogan, "Come and take it," a term used by the Spartans when the Persians tried to conquer them, and used by the American fort of Fort Morris during the American Revolution. The Texans then fired upon the Mexican camp with their cannon, forcing them to withdraw back to San Antonio de Bexar before they could even reload. In the aftermath of the battle, 2 Mexicans were dead, with the only Texan casualty being the wounded cavalryman who was bucked from his horse. Despite the battle being inconsequential in military terms, it was an important symbolic victory which signaled the beginning of the Texan Revolution, and it remains an important piece of history and heritage in Texas, with the cannon and a replica of the Come and Take It flag on display in Gonzales.